you have to go against your interest more because you have to have stake in the network. And then for the environmental one, that's not debatable. That's just, it's better because you're not using a lot of mining power for sure.
Hello, everyone, and I have once again the fantastic pleasure of speaking with Desiree Campbell of Crypto Ramble, and we're going to do exactly what that mentions, which is to ramble about crypto here. Specifically, this topic is proof of work versus proof of stake and all the kinds of different consensus things, just sort of a general open discussion, and it's especially pertinent because recently the Dash Core Group has been talking about, in the context of Dash, revisiting the consensus model. Is it going to stay just proof of work? Is there going to be a redistribution towards miners? Is there going to be proof of stake, etc.? So this might be a good time to have that big old knockdown, drag out talk about why proof of work, why proof of stake, what's the difference, what else is there out there, and just generally talk about consensus. So first, about mining, proof of work mining. That is what Bitcoin uses. That's what launched the crypto space. That's what a lot of top projects use. Well, why do you think that is?
Me.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Desiree, as Joel kindly introduced me, and I just want to say thank you for your time. I would also like to add that I really entered the crypto space through my work with Particle. It's a privacy coin, if you could say that a privacy coin exists. And so it uses proof of stake. It wasn't started as proof of stake, but started as a proof of work coin that then had a token swap to a new chain that was Particle. So I definitely come from the bias of proof of stake being better because all the people I was around was like proof of stake. But when I was first learning about how blockchains work, I did take some time to read the Bitcoin paper, the original one published by Nakamoto, and had an understanding of why it is that the way consensus happens for a blockchain is to ensure that the miners who organize the transactions can prove that, yes, the money that is being spent by a certain address actually exists. And once it's spent, you can't spend it another time because that transaction isn't there anymore. And so the way that happens is that you have to put up enough. Right. I would say the reason why is that you have to make sure that the transactions as they are organized on the blockchain are correct. So you have to ensure that who said that they had this money, a certain address, actually had the money. And then when they spent it, they're not able to say that they still have those funds and spend it again. And so the way that's done is that the miners have to do some work and be disincentivized to lie about how they're writing onto the blockchain. And the way that they do that is to make sure that they use their computing power. They solve a difficult problem that requires a certain amount of power. So they're expending power that only a certain number of people will have that power. So it's not likely, it's very, very highly unlikely that there would be enough available computing power to lie about how you organize the transactions on the blockchain. So
Yes.
that's the basic logic behind proof of work.
So do you
explain that right?
So do you think that makes a network secure? Do you think it's good at making a network secure against being attacked or any other kind of thing?
I do think that it makes a network yes. There is a possibility that now we have mining pools and they can, share their computing power or their hashing power. So it's possible that enough miners can come together to create so much hashing power that they could potentially lie about how the transactions are written on the blockchain specifically. They could do the double spend attack, and the way you put it earlier is they kind of write a set of blocks in secret and then add it to the chain later. That's like the whole double spend issue. So it's possible, but it's still highly unlikely. I would say that yes, it does secure the blockchain. That was the whole reason why Bitcoin could be invented in the first place, because they came up with this mechanism to make that possible. So yeah, yes.
Yeah. So it seems like the main reason people care about these kinds of consensus methods is they want a network that's secure, and you can't just jump in and attack it. And you also want something that's decentralized, which means you have no central point of failure, which means not one person controls the network and then can disrupt it in its own way. So proof of work is supposed to be decentralized because anyone can run it. Anyone can just jump in, fire up a computer, build a machine, whatever, and just point it at the network and just participate in its security. And while not everyone can do it, everyone can do it. Not everyone can get enough hash power to actually make a difference. So I can't just create a computer and then just run some bot that just spins up a bunch of different instances that we're all miners, and then all of a sudden I got the network. No, you have to put the work in. You have to actually do the computing power, and that's supposed to keep it decentralized and it's secure enough, and then anyone can participate. So it's decentralized enough. Now, what do you think about the practicality of proof of work decentralization? Do you think it's a pretty decentralized system?
No. I know that when it started out, someone who say had a gaming, I don't know the specs, but if you had like a very powerful computer, you could do the mining yourself. But because there's an arms race over time as it gets more and more difficult, you need more and more powerful computers. So in practicality, no. Now you have to have special, I forget what the acronym means, but you have to have ASICs in order to mine, and it's concentrated in terms of the wealth required to purchase and run that kind of equipment. And also it's geographically centralized because certain places it costs less for them to burn that power with electricity. So no, in practicality, no.
Yeah. So I remember seeing some kind of a study that was made by Princeton University, I believe either 1 or 2 years ago. It's relatively recent, that basically found that 80+% of mining power was located in China. Now, of course, a lot of this might have to do with the ease of access of mining equipment when most of the manufacturers are there because cheap manufacturing, as well as subsidized electricity. And so while it's become kind of concentrated in a couple of big pools, depending on the coin. Now, first off, do you see that? Do you see that as a problem? Do you see it as a problem if 1 or 2 big actors control most of the hash rate? Do you think that they will do anything malicious with that, or isn't it in their best interest to just keep mining and keep the network secure and just not cause any trouble, even if they could?
I think that it would be in their best interest to just keep mining and not cause any trouble. But the whole point of decentralization is that you don't have to put trust into human entities, which is what you're doing. When you can make that calculation, why would they bother to do that? Like, you can make wealth, gain wealth from continuing to mine and probably become better at it over time because you're getting rewards and you can afford the new equipment as you need better equipment. So I would say, I don't think that they're going to act badly. However, there's the fact that you're asking the rest of the network to trust you, which the whole point of this decentralized blockchain was to not trust anyone, just have a trustless ledger. And also, you're asking people to trust you. And there's something else. I can't remember what I was going to say. There's something else I was going to say. Give me 1 second. You're asking people to trust you, and then
I guess you're trusting that someone else won't necessarily attack one of those single entities and then bring the whole rest of the thing down.
Well, the other thing is that those entities might not want to do anything to the network, but there's also the political issue to think about. Maybe their government wants them to do something. That's the other thing I would add.
Yeah, of course. Now, there are some coins out there that do some kind of screwy things to sort of get around the ASIC and mining pool centralization problem. For example, coins like Monero like to reset the mining algorithm so that then anyone can still mine, because over long enough period of time, you can develop hardware specialized towards any algorithm. Now, of course, if you keep changing that, then you keep on making sure that there's no machines that can kind of mine that more efficiently. So it just tends to be more general mining. And then there's, of course, coins like Digibyte, which have a bunch of different mining algorithms that only a certain percentage of the hash rate can be for each one. And have you given much thought into those kinds of solutions? Do you think they're the right direction or the wrong direction compared to ASICs and my big mining pools, or is it something kind of in between?
I would hesitate to say either right or wrong. I have heard about what Monero does. I've heard the name Digibyte, but I didn't know it was because they have only a certain percentage of the hashing power is dedicated to a certain kind of mining algorithm. I didn't know that, which makes some sense. I think that it's a trade-off. I think probably this is what we're going to talk about, whatever algorithm you come up with to create consensus on your network, you're going to have pros and cons to it. So when I heard about what Monero does, I think they just did something recently. I thought that was cool. I think it's great, but at the same time, it's like, well, the devs, again, it's putting trust in people, and maybe you're always going to be putting trust in someone when it comes to humans creating some software that we use. I would say that is more decentralized, but I wouldn't say it's right or wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now it's kind of a general picture of proof of work, which is what most cryptocurrencies I think use. I haven't verified it's most, but in terms of market share, it's most of them because it's Bitcoin, of course. And it's also Ethereum still at this point, although that might not be forever. And then Litecoin and Bitcoin Cal, all the Bitcoins, all million of them. Most of the top coins tend to be proof of work, although not all of them. Now, you're a fan of proof of stake more than proof of work, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
So what's like the basic breakdown of proof of stake, and then why do you think it's, a better alternative?
The basic breakdown of proof of stake is that in order to decide who gets to write transactions to the network, and you trust that it's an honest node writing them properly, you don't have to have a certain amount of computing power, but you have to have a certain amount of vested interest or stake in the network. And that's based on, at least the mechanisms that I know of, based on the amount of coins you hold, the amount of tokens out of the total supply, and also how long you've held them as well. And that sort of determines which randomly chosen node gets chosen to write those transactions. It's just based on your stake. And what was the second question?
And so why does this strike you as a superior alternative to the old steady manual transmission proof of work?
Well, I think the two biggest arguments would be the environmental one, and also the incentive to be honest. So this is debatable, but when you have a certain percentage of the supply in the network, it doesn't make sense for you to, if you lie about the transactions So if you're a dishonest node, you'll be booted from the network,
Mm-hmm.
and you lose. At least I know for Particle. I'm not sure how it works in other coins. You lose the coins that you have. So it doesn't make sense for you to lie, and then you're probably going to get caught, and then you'll never be trusted as a node again. And you have to hold a certain percentage, and the more you hold, the more likely you are to be chosen to write and to get stakes in the future. Whereas with proof of work, you don't necessarily have to hold a certain percentage of the coins. Most likely you will, because when you mine, you get rewards. But you can always sell them and then continue to mine, because you just have to have the computing power to do it. You don't necessarily have to have a certain amount of coins in the network. So you have to go against your interest more, because you have to have stake in the network. And then for the environmental one, that's not debatable. That's just, it's better because you're not using a lot of mining power, for sure.
Yeah, so when we get to the whole, the one thing I'm not quite as knowledgeable on is the environmental thing. Of course, it makes sense that, yeah, you're using a ton of computing power, you're using a ton of electricity that's using up power, which might burn fossil fuels or whatever else. Do you think, first off, with a lot of power plants, there's off times when it's not productive to shut down the plant, even though you're producing energy that's not being used. So you could potentially run miners off of already existing electricity that doesn't need to, that's not being used for other purposes. It could be extremely cheap. And then there's also, of course, renewable energy like solar panels and things like that that can kind of help mitigate that. Do you think that that's ever going to be enough, or do you think it's like, do you think will ever be enough to where there's not a significant environmental impact, or do you think it's just fundamentally kind of a flawed system that just has to eat through electricity to secure?
I wouldn't call it. You see, it's like saying it's fundamentally flawed is like totally writing it off. And to me,
Mm-hmm.
I get this feedback a lot, that I'm like, I tend to be on the fence, or I don't like go
Yeah.
like attack something enough. Usually it's for political stuff, not like crypto related stuff. But it's a
Mm-hmm.
trade-off, you know. I think that proof of work solved a really huge issue in terms of creating consensus for a distributed or decentralized ledger. And I don't necessarily think it's bad. If we do have renewable energy, if I think if humans decided to focus on renewable power sources, it would become efficient enough to provide power exponentially over time to meet the needs of something like Bitcoin. Because the amount of power, I don't know exactly how much, but I know it's huge. I do think it's possible if humans went down that path to create enough energy for that, because the more you develop something, the better it gets, and it tends to happen exponentially. So I think
Yeah,
it's
of
possible,
course.
but I don't have those calculations in front of me to say yes, for sure. So yeah.
Yeah. Now there's as with the trade-offs and things, I noticed that there's coins like, for example, Ethereum, that are talking a lot about proof of stake, but have not been proof of stake for a long time. And uh, what do you think about? Do you think it's possible to have a successful network start out purely proof of stake, or does that have to be a transition period at some point?
I don't know. This is something that you mentioned. I'm not
Mhm.
sure. Um, it was something to do with centralization. I don't actually know the arguments behind why. I'm guessing it's because so few people, like automatically someone would have 51% of the network or something. Is that what it is? I don't know what the
Yeah.
issue is
So
there.
essentially, and some of this is an interesting discussion that we can get into later, based on the semantics of, is this like theoretically a decentralized thing or practically, and kind of what are the differences. But essentially, with proof of stake, the only way, a purely proof of stake system, the only way to get more units of the coin is to already have some. And so if you start out, first off, there has to be something pre-mined for a proof of stake thing, because you can't
You
otherwise
mean it?
mine it.
All right. Wait. But you mean in order to get stakes, but you can buy and sell. Like you can get
Yes.
coin. You just mean in
If
order to stake.
Yes, and if the stakers are selling, so say the first person has 1 unit of the coin, and
Right.
then they stake that, and then they get all the 100% of the block reward because they're the only one staking, and then at some point they decide to I'm going to sell to my buddy, sells to the buddy who then starts staking. Now you have two people staking, and then they might sell to a couple other people, but eventually you get to like 12 people who are staking, and they're not on exchanges, they're not doing anything, they're just holding on. And of course this is a theoretical thing, this is not necessarily how the world works, but those 12 people could control the entire percentage of the coin forever, the entire supply. And so that might be why a lot of projects start with proof of work, because then anyone can mine, the coins get scattered everywhere, and then eventually you can say, all right, now it's scattered enough that you can practically have anyone participate in the system by staking, because you can kind of buy and sell and things like that. Now, what do you think about like the time horizon for those kinds of things? Or first off, do you think that there's a way that proof of stake doesn't need to be mined first? There's a way to distribute that initial bit so it's not as much of a small cabal of people controlling it.
Yeah, I understand the problem now, and I would say no. I don't think it's possible to be this theoretical proof of stake where it's just one person begins and then, no. I would say you have to do something, maybe not proof of work, like a mining at the beginning to distribute the coins,
Mm-hmm.
and then do like a token swap thing, like with particle or other coins. I don't know. Maybe something else, but to answer your question. No, I don't think you could just start off with proof of work. Or I
Or
don't
proof
think
of
you
stake.
should. Sorry, proof of stake. Or I don't think you should.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, and that's the other part of the discussion I'm sure a lot of people would have is, at what point is the supply distributed or decentralized enough to where you can actually like cut off that wild card of anyone can technically mine? And like I mean, Ethereum's been around what, 4 years or so? Well, no, less than that, I think, right?
2013, was it when they came out? Was that
Nah,
or
it was
2014?
it was
I don't know what I'm
several
talking
years
about.
late. It was several years later, but
Okay.
that's
I
is
thought
there
it
a that's what I'm saying. And the funny thing about Ethereum in particular is it was the initial supply was pre-mined and distributed in an ICO, and then they had mining as well. So
okay.
they kind of had both of those, and then now you got proof of stake on the horizon, hopefully. And so, is there a time frame that you just say, okay, when we start this coin, we're going to wait 3 years, or we're going to wait 5 years, or we're going to wait whatever, and then we're going to switch? Or is there a thing where you go start analyzing the blockchain and just say, what's the distribution like? And at that point, are you like, this is probably decentralized enough. We can probably start opening it up to just do proof of stake, and we don't need miners. Do you think that that's a bad? Do you think that it's like a play by ear, or should it be like a set in stone kind of a thing?
I think it should be something that's decided early on. I just looked, by the way, and Ethereum
Hmm.
started in 2015. Um, I would say it just has to be decided beforehand. I don't like the play by ear idea because sounds like it's gonna get messy.
Mm,
So the people who decide to start, whether it's some kind of crowd started thing, maybe they could have some kind of vote, where people who are interested vote on what kind of distribution consensus they want, or maybe the devs decide, and if people don't like it, then they just don't get any. But someone's gonna have to decide, and I would say decide it beforehand personally. Now, I don't know how you would decide what is too centralized, or what is
hmm.
decentralized enough. That that's very subjective. So it's just gonna have to be arbitrarily decided.
Yeah, exactly. And that's an argument I kind of get into. Not necessarily an argument like I'm trying to fight and win on one side or the other, but it's an interesting discussion because um, theoretically, if you want a decentralized system, anyone should be able to participate. And if you have a proof of stake based system, if you want to go super theoretical, not everyone can participate because you need some kind of permission to someone who already has a unit of the token already in order to participate. Whether it's the exchange that holds it on, whether it's someone who's already staking, whether it's just someone with some in their wallet that's not staking, you can't participate unless someone lets you. And that's like a very philosophical, that's a very like theoretical like thing that makes it sound like it's no good. Now, if you talk about practicality, practically if it's on a whole bunch of exchanges, practically if there's a whole bunch of stakers who need to spend it for living expenses, you can still get some. And then of course the reverse is also true of proof of work. Theoretically, anyone can run a computer. Theoretically, anyone can do this, but practically it's a very centralized production of mining equipment situation, which, theoretically you could break into yourself, but it's going to be very difficult. And there's just a very few miners that are in there that are established and making significant profits off the network. So practically, you do kind of have to deal with those present actors anyway. And so, in a practical sense, what do you think about the decentralization of a well-established, well-distributed system of either? Is it kind of practically just about the same?
Practically, it's just about the same because of like the centralization is just about the same. Because if you have enough wealth, then you can buy a lot of tokens. But I do think for like the same kind of market cap kind of coin, it's easier to buy enough mining equipment than to buy like enough of the actual supply. But I think for centralization, they're about the same.
Yeah. So I guess that's where it becomes a trade-off where if you don't know your coin's entire supply is like super well distributed, maybe it is a little bit, but not well enough, then you have some centralization risks maybe by making it proof of stake only, but then it becomes so much more secure or more difficult to attack than it would be if you can just divert some mining power for like a couple $100 an hour and just ruin the whole chain. Now, that's the other thing is I hear this thing, you hear mantras in the community, right? That usually have some sort of an origin, even if it's a misconception. And so I hear a lot of times whenever I say, hey, proof of stake, they're like, oh, that sucks, it's terrible. Like, why? And then the knee jerk is it's not secure or it's centralized. We just talk about the centralized bit, which I'm sure that's what comes behind the idea. Well, first, a second thing on the centralized bit, which is, it's kind of more of a slur than a technical term these days. But despite that, is there anything wrong with like the current holders having too much power that you can't just participate because everyone else already has all the money and, it's just rich people controlling your coin. Whoever has the most money controls it, and that's no good. What do you think of that general argument? Because I have heard people say that before about, for example, the masternode structure for Dash, which is not quite proof of stake, but it's still based on units that you have to own units of the coin to have a vote, for example. So in order to run the network, you need to have money, and then the richer you are, the more important of a person you are. And like that, a lot of people have issue with that idea. Like I don't know if it's a practical issue, but it's definitely like some people don't like the feeling of that. What do you think of that idea?
I think that you need a way to secure the network. Like you're going to have a way to decide who writes those transactions. Like people have to first become comfortable with that idea. Like you need to, maybe not, I was going to say elect. You need to elect certain addresses. Let's not say people, like certain addresses to secure the network for you. I would say that the idea behind proof of stake is that you're choosing someone who has a lot of tokens because it won't make sense for them to lie. Like it makes sense for them to be honest because they have so much of the network supply. So what they're upset about is exactly it's exactly the theory the human psychology, I guess, theory behind why you want those people to secure the network. Like that's the whole reason for it.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, especially when you talk about security, and which is harder to attack. Now, that's one of the things with the ASIC mining of proof of work, where ASIC ASICs just come about as a natural market reaction, right? People are always going to find a way to solve the puzzle. In this case, a literal like puzzle of proof of work faster and better. And so they develop tools to do that. And that does make a network harder to attack if you have specialized hardware that you need to do. Now, here's a question of incentives, right? You'd say, oh, it's if you just have some mining equipment and not units of the coin itself, then it's going to be much easier for you to just throw away that investment and just attack the network because you don't actually have that. Now, on the other hand, let's say you are a I'll just pick a random thing. Let's say you are a PIVX whale and you have a ton of PIV and you're just loaded with PIV and you just for some reason hate Particle. And so you want to destroy Particle and you're like, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to switch my tokens over and I'm going to exchange them for part and then attack the network and then, I don't know, get out at some point. And of course, it's how easy is it to just laterally move into the coin and attack it versus if you have mining and you can potentially dump all those tokens. Maybe you take a big loss, maybe you don't. You probably do take a big loss if you just ruined it. But versus if you have specialized mining equipment that works on just the algorithm for the coin, that's a lot harder. It's a more of a sunk cost to just jump into, and you can't really, they're just useless at that point. And of course, they're kind of the same thing in that you have to invest in it, specifically in the network. And at some point, you kind of have to ruin your investment to attack it a little bit. So I don't know. What do you think of that little conundrum or trade-off?
Well, I would just say exactly what you said, that you have to ruin your investment to do that. Why would you ruin your investment? If it's a super small market cap coin, then like that's the issue. But that's the issue with I think for both proof of work and proof of stake, because if you're a super small market cap, that means for proof of work, you haven't been mined a lot, so it's probably not that hard yet to solve the algorithmic puzzle. Well, why would someone decide to? They would just have to want to throw their money away, and they would have to have a lot of hate, I guess, in their heart to decide to spend their money just for the purpose of destroying something. It doesn't make sense for a human, like game theory wise. It just doesn't. Why would someone do that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now that's
for both proof of work, proof of stake. Now,
here's the other thing I thought of, which is an interesting option. So if you have 100% if someone gets 2/3 of some malicious actors, like, you know what, it's worth it for me to attack this coin. And they get enough of the coin that they can now attack it. And so now it's controlled by a bad actor. And the same goes for hash power. If you get enough hash power to 51% attack a proof of work coin, the remaining users can fork off, i.e. Bitcoin fork. So you can just say, like, look, we're going to be mining on this other one. There's going to be a split. We're not going to be with those bad people. We get rid of those people. And especially if you change a mining algorithm, it's harder for the attacker to now jump on. It's a little bit more sunk cost. Now, one thing I was thinking of is if you do something like that with a proof of stake coin, this attacker now has coins on both chains. And so the attacker now controls both chains as well. So you can't quite get away from him. And I have seen people do I forget which project it was that did something like that or considered that, but they did a sort of proof of stake. I think it was Smart Cash did that. And Smart Cash isn't even proof of stake, but the stake there was the stake there allows you to vote on things. And so they actually did a proof. They did a hard fork. They split off, but then they did it from a snapshot of the coin supply from before a certain event. So they redistributed the supply in the hard fork, where they're like, well, before this bad person got all the coins, We want that one. We want that version of the coin supply, sort of like with Ethereum with the hard fork to get rid of the DAO tokens. And so is it like harder to just fork off if the network gets attacked in a proof of stake coin? That's a thing I've been thinking about, and I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know if it's harder to fork off, and I don't know if you can. I guess you're saying you can go back to a certain time. I do know that you can, like when they do a fork. I'm not just saying particle a lot to shield particle because I'm so involved with the project.
It's a point of reference.
Yeah. I know that when they push a certain update, if you just download the new client, it automatically is on that specific chain. So I know it's easy to say, get this chain to the rest of the network, but I don't know, I know it's easy to appoint an official chain if there's a split, when a split occurs, but I don't know if you can go back to the point where, say, a certain actor doesn't have a certain amount of the supply. I don't know that.
Yeah, so that's always like a nuclear option.
I can ask.
Thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that you can do snapshots. I mean, people have done that before. In fact, if you think about it, like an airdrop, like when one of the Bitcoins split off, they copied the supply of the other. So all the old holders with the old keys had access to the new ones. Now there have been some, I can't remember for the life of me, but some of the worst forks of Bitcoin that had that, and they like had some extra founders reward or some other thing, like they added on to that, and it's like, all right, that's a little bit strange. But now one of the things I hear when they talk about proof of stake and security is they talk, it's just not as secure. And like, why? Well, it's just not secure. That's what I hear most often.
Wait, what you just said? It's not secure. Why? It's just not secure.
It's just not secure. It's one of those things like, when you say, your coin is centralized if you don't have small blocks. That's another thing I hear. It's all weird. You hear a lot of those things. But the thing behind, like, why is it not as secure? I think, so generally speaking, so proof of stake has a million implementations. They're evolving all the time. I guess the one thing behind a lot of that argument, the real argument rather, tends to be with proof of work. Proof of work is very hard to spoof in that you have to have a certain amount of power going through the network to create a certain amount of hash power. You have to have a certain amount of electricity burned, and you just can't really fake that. However, there have been a few that have a few proof of stake coins that have had some sort of exploits to that. Not, you can just like mint fake coins or whatever like that, but that you could fake that you had a certain supply. Like, for example, there was a way you could trick the network into thinking you had some when you didn't. Or in some cases, there was a situation where you could have a certain amount of coins, like say you had enough to stake, and then you moved it to a second address, and it queried the first address, but you moved it in such a way that it saw the timestamp of the first address and then the second address, so it thought you had double the coins you actually did. And you could like attack the network by like tricking people into thinking you had more than you had. I think PivX had a few of these, or at least one of these exploits that then they, after a few months over, I believe it was the beginning of the year, they fixed it. But yeah, and some random person on Twitter, which is, always how it goes, said something to the effect of there's always new like ways of spoofing stake. And for every one problem they solve with each implementation seems to come up with 4 more or something like that, which, is an opinion, and I haven't looked into it too much. But I don't know. What do you think of like the inherent moving target of like trying to make sure the stake actually applies in proof of stake, whereas with mining you don't have to kind of worry about it as much?
I'm not a developer, but that sounds to me like it's not an issue with proof of stake itself, but with the code, like who wrote it and who could like foresee what kind of attacks would come. Like it doesn't sound like it's like proof of stake itself. And I would guess, again, I'm not a developer, that proof of work might not have this exact issue in terms of spoofing, as you term it. but some other kind of attack that is more susceptible to where it has to do with the code itself and not like actually the concept behind the algorithm. So like I guess that's a legitimate argument, but that's like saying let's not use technology because we can't write it perfectly every time to fit the idea that we have.
Yeah, and another thing I was like, this is the rabbit hole of all rabbit holes if you think about it, because just now it's like how do we construct the world, and it's just so much technology, and proof of work has been around for so long, so there's fewer questions about it maybe. Although in my opinion, last couple of years have shown a lot about how it ends up working out, from a lot of ASIC resistant coins getting ASICs, a lot of ones that change their algorithm frequently still got ASICs in the interim, and things like that. There's a bunch of things like that. Manufacturing bottlenecks. Now, as far as like centralization attack vectors, which are always fun to theorize about, the problem with mining is one group or a few enough groups can get like a lot of the hash power and possibly attack or become a centralizing force on the network, because it's just the way it tends to be with manufacturing, and people are able to do that. Now, so that therefore you risk like a few big mining farms in China running the network. Now, with proof of stake, one thing I heard is what happens if you switch to proof of stake, and then who has a lot of the supply? Well, exchanges. So now does Binance completely run your coin, for example? And that's like the centralization risk. Or do you have Binance, Kraken, and Bitfinex? They all together run your coin, and then like the users or the lowly whale stakers just can't quite get that. So I don't know. What do you think?
The lowly whale stakers. Sorry, that was just funny. Yeah.
Yes, that'd be a good name for a seaside pub, the lonely whale staker. But
against exchanges, I'm writing that.
Yes. So mining centralization from manufacturers and farms in, say, China versus exchanges just hoarding the supply and just running the whole thing. I don't know. What do you think is do you think that one is a bigger threat or a more likely threat?
It depends on the coin, because as you were saying, the way proof of, at the very beginning we were talking theoretically about having a proof of stake coin without distribution at first, and it's only if there's enough available supply left when an exchange decides to become interested in a coin to get that much of it. So, or I mean, like if someone's willing to sell it, because you have to buy that. And so it depends on the coin, I would say. For certain established coins, I don't think it would be possible, even if the exchanges had a lot of money. Because even if they have lots of money and they're just trying to get coins that aren't available to buy, then the price will just go up, and they'll never be able to get like as much as they want to do that. But that's only for some coins. There might be a coin where for some reason they're really popular and an exchange can get in at the very beginning, and then they might be able to get a good amount of it.
Yeah. I mean, I do know there's always been, in the beginning of a coin, there's been just a lot of the supply ends up on like one or so exchange. And then, over time it sort of scatters around. Of course, that one exchange is more than happy to sell things around and not remain in power. But I guess especially if it's pre-proof of stake for the coin. And then just over time becomes more distributed. It's less of a vector. Yeah, talking about this, it just seems like whether or not proof of work always kind of works, and always kind of old and problematic too. And it seems like proof of stake is the much smoother, sleeker version to a lot of things, but you have to get the conditions a lot more right. Whereas you can just mine a coin at any stage in its existence. It's a mineable coin. You can either mine your little laptop there, or you have to build specialized hardware, whatever. It just like works. But to a certain extent, whereas proof of stake seems to be a lot smoother and better, but it's really tricky to get right in terms of like the supply distribution, because if that's off, then the whole thing is just messed up.
Something else I want to mention, simply because I noticed it looking through my notes after I already kind of said what my opinion was on proof of work and proof of stake. is proof of stake in some ways is more resistant to censorship because you don't have to have special equipment. So a government can't say, we know you're buying this mining equipment, so you're going to have a license in order to do this. It's just, you can be more secretive about it because you don't have as much of a physical presence. Now, you could say that if you're running a VPS or virtual private server for your nodes or something, then you could be stopped that way. But that's one thing. And then something else I want to mention, which is I thought it was kind of far-fetched, but I was trying to look up arguments against proof of stake, and I found this article that was talking about very small percentage what if doomsday sort of scenarios that they're not likely to happen at all, but the longer a network exists, the more likely it is for it to happen just because it's been so much time, even though the percentage initially is so small. So like if for some reason everyone lost connection to the internet, this article was saying, well, how would you decide what chain is the right chain when everyone comes back online? Like, but it seems so like
strange,
far-fetched. But that was like another thing. Like, you suppose all the networks, all the nodes on the network for some reason didn't have access, and then they all came back. Like, what do they do then? How do they like decide then? Something like that.
Probably the same as when they first came online, right? You just, whoever has the stake, and I guess you can't really erase stake by like putting the unless you're using a Lightning Network, but hey, that's a different argument of I think I like what you said before about the secretive aspect. And of course, you can't run major infrastructure to a major payment or otherwise data network and just have it be completely secret. However, in a proof of stake, or for example, with the Dash Masternode system, the proof of service kind of setup, everything that the nodes do, every bit of power and physical bandwidth and all the other kind of stuff is purpose towards running the actual transactions and sending stuff, actually the network. With proof of work, there's some of it that's that, but most of it is towards just securing the network, which, literally does secure the network, but they're burning energy for the sake of burning energy, and that's what makes it secure. And so that means you're going to be spending a lot more energy, having a lot more output, a lot more physical output than you would have otherwise to run that amount of transactions and activity, which means you can probably see mining farms from space. You just see these giant, like, rumbling things just sucking up all this stuff. And it's like, you can't, it's like, hey, what do you do in your backyard? It's all glowing. Oh, nothing. Just, working on some, Christmas decorations. It's like, it's not nearly as like easy to hide if you just have like a server in the back room and a VPN saying, oh no, it's somewhere else. And, it's a little bit harder to physically attack, I guess, proof of stake, except, for the actual, you could just shut down exchanges, and then you take everyone's money, and then, which it seems like there's always going to be an attack vector. It depends on who is trying to attack. If you have like a collusion of all the state actors together, you're pretty much at some point screwed as far as that network's concerned. You can always spin up a clone of some other clone, keep starting over, and then you never catch that. But as far as like the one, now it goes to like the China thing again. I did a little preliminary research, and of course, it's known that 80+% of mining power for Bitcoin's out of China. When I looked for Dash, it was somewhere around 75%. Now, Dash has the dual security model with masternodes, and I wonder what the geographic distribution is for stakers. Because when I looked at masternode hosting providers or hosting locations, it was all mostly Western Europe and the US. So you kind of do attack Dash Network presently. If you just wanted to target infrastructure, there would be China on the one hand, and then Western Europe and the US and Canada on the other hand. So it's like, how are you going to get all those governments to like be on the same team? That's a little harder. Whereas if it's just China, you could just whack them. So I don't know. What do you think about like stake, like proof of stake, do you think richer countries will end up, it'll be staking power will be centralized in richer countries, or do you think it'll be poor countries, or how do you think the geographics, the jurisdictional attributes of proof of stake shake out? We know how they shake out with mining, but what about with proof of stake?
I don't know about I don't know the statistics on it, but I would guess that yes, richer countries would, just because of the like knowledge gap.
Mm-hmm.
Like most people who are discussing and talking about these things aren't coming from countries like I'm from Jamaica.
Well, although it is funny, I saw some study that was released earlier in the year. Supposedly, the top percentage the top country in the world for crypto ownership is Turkey. 1 in 5 Turks has owned some kind of cryptocurrency, and then like a second and third, or I think like Colombia and Brazil or something like that.
I was going to mention Brazil. I had heard about Brazil. I was like, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't say how much they have, but maybe as a percentage of people who are involved.
Yeah, well, that's different. Like how many users versus how many are owned. So
yeah,
that's it. This is kind of a slight tangent, and if you want, we can talk about this another time, like even another video. But you were talking about exchanges being an issue, and is there ever going to be an actual decentralized exchange that's like convenient and user friendly? Because I just hear, for my first, I got interested in like learning about crypto in like mid 2017, and I've just been hearing about decentralized exchanges that they're coming, and it seems like it's never gonna happen, because that would solve a lot of these issues about like liquidity and who gets to.
Yeah, there's a few. People keep telling me about Komodo, and then they had one DEX that then that went down. They have another one. I don't know if you've used BISC before.
I have. But like I mean specifically, like not just peer to peer, like local Bitcoins or that kind of thing, but something that's like a Coinbase, like something that's like nice to use and like easy, and you don't have to be like
a lot of shade you're throwing at BISC there, huh?
But but it's decentralized. I feel like I would love that. Would really change a lot, I think, in the whole space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that they're very difficult to set up now, and practice and theory are always different. Now that's one reason why I feel strongly about using Dash for transactions and coins that have similar things, because of instant send. Every Dash transaction is basically confirmed in 2 seconds, which means you can just watch the markets from the comfort of your own Trezor or whatever, and as soon as you want to make a trade, just deposit it, and if the exchange is one of those ones that accepts it, that recognizes instant send, you can just deposit and make the trade and get it right off the exchange. And there's a crypto trader YouTuber guy, Da Vinci Jeremy, who has this thing called a Pandora's wallet, which is a trader's wallet that it's like you control the keys, and it has like hookups to all the major exchanges. And so when you want to make a trade, you can do it automatically, and it deposits to the exchange, makes the trade, and then withdraws back to the wallet that you control. And so that kind of stuff, that doesn't mean you don't use centralized exchanges, but minimizes your exposure to them. The time your funds, or the total fund time of the coin that ends up it stays on an exchange, it gets much reduced. So you don't have people just leaving piles of coins on exchanges waiting for the opportunity to trade, that they hold on to their coins instead. And then they can just, I got to move it to trade. And so if someone hacks or someone takes down the exchange, you might lose options to trade, but you don't lose your funds unless you were just caught at that moment.
Okay. I feel like it was just kind of a side note that decentralized exchanges would help. But it's different from the main topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've been rambling for close to an hour. This is probably where we have to cut this one off. We might have to talk about hybrid systems another time, but there's plenty of talk on that to be had, I'm sure.
Yeah, I thought we would get to that today. Do you have a time limit on this? So we have to stop now?
No, not necessarily, but I mean, I guess we can do another quick extension on that. Yeah, why don't we just knock it out of the way? So,
Yeah, I'm curious about the hybrids.
first, what do you think of the concept of doing a proof of stake, proof of work hybrid to where half of it is one, half of it's the other?
Um, I think it's unnecessary. I was just about to say, like, I'm interested in the topic, but I think it's unnecessary. Like, why? Like, how does it help to have both? It's like you have both sets of benefits, and then both sets of drawbacks. I guess maybe it could help with, like you were talking about digibyte
Mm-hmm.
and having like a certain percentage of the hash rate, or however you described it, be for a certain kind of algorithm, so that it can't become centralized in a certain way by too much of a percentage. So maybe it could be similar if you have a hybrid system where, yeah, we'll get centralization, but only for like half of the coins network.
Yeah.
Maybe that's useful. So you can have different kinds of participants, multiple kinds of participants helping to secure the network. I guess that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Hybrid systems tend to make it less easy to attack based on like one network if you kind of need a little bit of both. So, for example, if you're an exchange and you have like a significant portion of the coins, you could it's a proof of stake project. There's that centralization vector. Whereas if you're a mining pool, you have a completely you're controlling a completely separate coin possibly. But what are the odds that you're going to be a significant exchange / holder and a significant miner at the same time? It's like at that point you kind of are the network and aren't really, you're just attacking yourself. It's kind of, it makes it a little bit, but then at the other hand, it might be redundant to, for one, make sure dedicate a lot of capital to securing the network rather than just trading or running around, whatever people do with proof of work coins. And on the other hand, you have to like pay a lot of the emissions out to miners to secure the network. And so it's kind of like by having to do both, it might be a little bit redundant for some people. But think about it. What happens if you have a proof of stake, proof of work hybrid, and someone finds someone like destroys a mining farm or something. Someone just destroys the biggest mining farm. Like say there's three big mining farms. Two of them collude, or the second largest one colludes and does a terrorist attack on the largest one or whatever, bombs it, it's gone. And then now they control most of the hash rate. Oh, you're in a bad position, but wait, you have proof of stake too, so you can't quite attack it. Or on the other hand, what happens if someone finds an exploit and manages to fake having a 51% stake in the network, and before the devs can patch it or figure out how to do it, they're already there attacking. Oh, but wait, they don't also control a mining farm, so they can't do that.
Yeah, when you put it that way, I was like, what's the point? But now when I hear you say it that way, I see it's like the benefits of diversification and reducing risk. So yeah, that makes sense. I'd say that does sound, yeah.
So, and this is the thing I've been, in my mind, it sounds like the best idea to do, just from like a very basic perspective, to do an equal part hybrid. Now, practically, I don't know if that's really necessary. So, for example, say you keep proof of work as the backup because it just works. It's just doesn't have as much risk, as many things that can go wrong. So you keep that as a backup, but it has all those drawbacks of like all the mining equipment and then all the energy consumption, and also miners dump on the network. They tend to dump to pay for their razor thin margins pretty quickly, whereas stakers don't have that. And it seems like the proof of work is like an annoying part. And so in that case, do you do a 50-50, like 50% proof of stake, 50% proof of work? Or do you do mostly proof of stake, like 90%, and just keep a 10% mining thing just so that they have to knock down. There's like that backup generator sort of effect, but mostly you're a proof of stake network. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? On which kind of a balanced approach would you do?
I don't know. I think maybe a 50-50. It's reminds me of the question earlier in terms of how you distribute, like when is it decentralized enough? And again, it seems kind of arbitrary. And also my mind's having a hard time wrapping my head around how do you have one chain with two different kinds of consensus algorithms? Like, how does that work? That might be too technical of a question, but like, how does that actually like work?
Yeah, I'm sure there's a few different ways it can work. In the Dash way of things, because Dash is proof of service masternode layer, everything works. It's all proof of work right now, right? It just
you cut out just now because Dash is a proof of work and then masternode layer, and I didn't hear what you said.
Yes. So the proof of service masternode layer, essentially, what happens is proof of work works. It just runs the network. That's kind of like the long and short of it. But the masternodes use this thing called chain locks to lock in the first seen block, and so that essentially makes it permanent. So if basically the miner who produces the first block, as it should be, is the first one is the real one. So you can't produce later blocks and then attack the network. So you can still have one miner that has like most of the hash rate, but you can't really do shenanigans with it. And so it's kind of like one locks in the other. So if someone has too much of the hash rate, you can't exactly if someone has too much of the hash rate, you can't exactly get away with publishing a secret chain and like attacking a network. Of course, you do have like one provider pretty much, but you can't really do funny business with the chain. Now, of course, if the master network, someone took over the master nodes and then they were like, oh, we're going to, first off, what they could do is they could just stop doing chain locks, in which case it just defaults back to the old security model of just proof of work. But, you don't actually get any headways into the network. So it's kind of, works in conjunction. So I don't know how a proof of stake, proof of work hybrid would be. It could be that like one of them's a block producer and the other's a block validator, which is kind of the way the Dash system works, where the block producers, the miners produce the blocks and then the masternodes do an extra validation step. It could be something like that, or it could be just half of you could need both at the same time, to where you could need to be a miner that also controls some kind of collateral. Or you could possibly just be like, well, half of the blocks get produced by one,
A miner that controls some of the collateral. That's like double incentive to secure the network.
Yeah, collateralized mining is what they called it. Now,
I like that, how that sounds theoretically.
Yeah, that was the original vision for Dash back in the day, was like many years down the road, there would be something called collateralized mining. But then there's a couple moments when some large actors got too much of the hash rate, not quite enough to attack it, but just close. And then so the Dash team said, well, we got this other solution that's like quicker, that just has the masternodes validate blocks. It's much more efficient. It's much more permanent, not as messy. But the concept of collateralized mining or staked mining, the thing is, you can still, I don't know exactly, because it's like a dual system, there's always a possibility you could do something like, disrupt it. Just makes it harder to enter the market. And that makes it, I guess, harder to, it makes it more likely to be centralized, possibly. Just harder to attack from one vector, but more likely to be centralized, since now there's two things you have to do to participate, rather than two separate groups with separate incentives that have to work in conjunction for the network to run. So yeah, that would be a little bit of a goofy thing, where you have to have both. It makes it really hard to enter the network.
Yeah, it does. Well, through securing it rather than just buying.
Yeah. Now, of course, some coins like PIVX have masternodes and stakers. And so you can either go through the infrastructure of running a node and then you prove you have a certain amount. I think it's 10,000 PIV for their masternodes in order to have a masternode, or you can just stake. And I don't think they use masternodes as a security model. I think it's just the staking, the block producing is a security model. But if something like Dash were to do something like that, you could possibly have, a masternode and staking dual security system, which still goes back to the root. It's not the same group, but it's still like the biggest barrier to entry is owning funds. And so it's kind of the same group. Or you could go crazy and have a triple threat model where you have like mining and stakers and masternodes. And I mean, at that point, you're just kind of like you're spamming things out there. It's like you're smashing the controller, hoping to get a power move out by accident. I don't know, not necessarily, but it is like you're doing. It's like
Yeah.
or like those old Bugs Bunny cartoons where he's like locking the door and he has like 12 different latches he's throwing on there. It could just be like, dude, just do the one lock that works. But
and it's a huge barrier to entry.
Yeah. So
to participate in securing the network.
That's one thing I was thinking always is the decentralization versus security trade-offs sometimes, because like what I was thinking with like something like say Digibyte's multi-algorithm thing is, well, it's a small enough coin that now the likelihood of ASICs on any one of those systems, on any one of those algorithms is pretty low. Or if there are ASICs, it still should be, if you have like a lot of computing power that's not specialized, you should still be able to like brute force any of those little algorithms, even though they're all unique. It could be that it becomes easier to attack. It's just kind of like if you have like, well, if you need to have, if you need to like run a miner on a laptop, like a little thing like that, and have a certain amount of stake to attack the network, then it's just like a cheaper to attack proof of stake, because it's a trivial cost to just like run on your spare machine to attack the network. So like if there's too many different things you got to focus on, maybe it becomes easier to attack at some point rather than harder.
Because it reduces the amount.
Yeah, it's like if you have a backup generator, like you have a main power source, then you have a good old backup generator. But what if you have like 10 different backups? Well, each of those is probably going to be pretty terrible because you can't afford a state-of-the-art system for each. So then it would be easy to just like not a single one of those power sources is enough to power your whole house, because there's just too many little ones. You have to kind of all run them together, or you have to just have like you'll power like one thing at a time.
Yeah. Well, I think do you want to go more into other, like a specific kind of hybrid system? Because I think we've kind of talked about a lot.
I think we're pretty much through that whole thing. The only thing that could really change is more specifics. Like if there's like a one versus the other system, and that's a lot more technical expertise than I'm likely to ever have. So maybe this is as far as we can go.
Yeah. I think I kind of said everything. There's something I didn't say, but I don't know if I need to bring it up. But I'll just mention this wasn't my original idea, but someone had mentioned it to me. Was, you know what? I won't bother to say it because it's the same. Okay, I'll say it. It's the same issue, but like a smaller version of it. So for proof of work, when the mining fees because they go down over time, there's even less incentive for miners to remain loyal, because then they're now not even getting like that much reward from like the network from mining. Like the only reward they would get is I guess if the price of the coin is increasing fast enough to keep it at par with the reduction of the mining fees, so that they're still getting like the same amount of actual monetary value out of it. So that was just like something else. Like, would they want to remain loyal? But that it's the same original issue where for proof of stake, you're going to have you're going to lose your own money if you decide to attack the network.
Yeah, that's another thing I didn't quite, we didn't bring up yet, but that's an interesting point because mining has fixed costs to a certain extent. You have to burn money to do it. The costs in proof of stake are capital based. You have to just sink your capital's opportunity costs in kind of doing that. So it's not like you have to you have to burn money. You have to maybe burn opportunity to do other things with the money, but you don't burn the money itself. And so as such, I remember people were talking about with BTC, old Bitcoin, introducing a tail emission to make sure miners are always compensated from the block reward, because without that, they didn't anticipate enough fee revenue to secure the network, because you have to either charge a lot of money for transactions or have a lot of transactions that are pretty cheap. Either way, they got to pay for the mining equipment. Now, if you're a proof of stake coin, for it to be worth it for people to decide to stake in the project, there still has to be some reward, but it's much more flexible. It's not like, oh, the rewards went down, I'm getting rid of my stake. You can have fewer or cheaper transactions on the network without having to actually,
you don't have fixed like overhead costs that you, like if you're running a business, you don't have fixed costs that you have to pay every single month, no matter how many sales you have.
Yeah, and that's the funny thing about which kind of encapsulates the proof of stake versus proof of work debate in general, is proof of work works because it's like analog. It's in the real world. You're running stuff, you have plants, you have miners, it's all like, but then the drawbacks are the same thing. It's just this big old expensive steam engine, kind of steampunk type thing, with whistles and gears and clocks all over it, just running this thing. Whereas proof of stake is all digital. It's all non-existent, basically. It's all in the ether. It's all, funny joke. It's all, it's all out there in the interwebs. It doesn't actually exist in the physical world, really, not as much. And so you have the efficiency of that, of the virtual world, but you don't necessarily, you have more risks associated with that, where it's harder to spoof physical resources than it is to spoof, digital resources. And so if you're thinking about that, it's sort of like using a car. Every car that I've ever used uses electricity, and they also use fuel, like fossil fuels. And then you got, hybrid systems like a Prius that kind of do a little bit of, that kind of use more electricity. Because ultimately, that's one reason I like manual transmission vehicles, is because if the battery dies, I can still push the vehicle, and then I can push it down the road like you see in the old movies or whatever, and get it started again. All I have to do is have old fuel. Whereas with a Tesla or something, that just stops working. You run out of juice, and it's harder to store backup batteries or whatever. But similarly, I think that we're going to move to a more digital world over time. So I think that proof of work is probably like old steady, and so far kind of irreplaceable. Like, people haven't found a way to get around that, especially in the founding of a coin. But like over time, it might just be a more stakified evolution. I don't know what to think about that.
I generally just agree with what you said just now. Do you think that Bitcoin could ever switch to proof of stake?
Bitcoin? No, I don't think so. That's kind of anti its ethos.
Yeah, but not ethos wise. Like, if people agree to it, like, it's possible for the devs to change is that possible?
I think so. But here's the thing about Bitcoin. This is another hour discussion, so we'll have to just got to end on that.
Okay.
Is Bitcoin did a lot of things better than anything that had been done before it. And that's why it was innovative. It was completely innovative. Nothing was like it. And now its value, part of it comes from the fact that it's still new and innovative to a certain extent over old systems. But it's all steady, where people are trying all kinds of stuff on shitcoins, and they all break and stuff doesn't work, and they're trying new things. There's new attacks, there's rollbacks, there's centralization problems, all this kind of stuff. And Bitcoin is like the old school thing that still works and is still reliable, and it's just very set in stone. There's that authenticity to it, and I think that's its competitive advantage. And once you start modifying too many things, once you start being like, yeah, we're, especially something as drastic as how does this whole thing work, I think that it's going to now have to compete with other networks that are a lot newer and maybe fancier and have better things. And so I think that like my hypothesis, which who knows what time will bear it out, is Bitcoin is is a finite project, because at some point, just like a manual transmission vehicle, at some point they're only going to make them for novelty, which is kind of the case right now. But at some point,
all the maximalists, everyone's going to achieve Bitcoin that they can't use really for the whole global population.
And so I think at some point it's going to become less relevant as cutting edge technology. And it might always be some sort of store of value or some kind of backup, because you always know how it's going to work. And you always have those old steam engines, running the whole thing. And you might always have that, but I think it's going to be a sunset type thing where it becomes like the new stuff kind of comes up, because the very thing that makes it irreplaceable today is the very thing that makes it resistant to change. Yeah, so
it'll become obsolete over time.
Yes.
Maybe. We'll see.
Ooh, yeah, we will see. Well, thanks very much for appearing on this very special segment of hour-long chats. And
thank you.
I hope the audience, of course, learned a whole lot from this extensive debate. But I think we have to keep on talking about this kind of thing, keep on thinking, and keep on innovating, because, at some point we don't want to be stuck with the wrong thing, and the wrong thing might not be obvious at this stage. The right and wrong might not be super obvious, but at some point there will be something that outcompetes the rest. And so, yeah, here's to finding that.
Yeah, we'll find out.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.